They took everything he had spent 15 years building. 6 hours later, he saved a stranger in the rain. By sunrise, she would own the company that betrayed him. The message appeared on James Anderson's phone at exactly 11:43 p.m. He stared at the glowing screen from the driver's seat of his aging Ford F-150 parked beneath a flickering gas station light on the edge of Cedar Ridge, Colorado. The words felt colder than the October rain tapping against his windshield. Effective immediately, your appeal has been denied. James exhaled slowly. 15 years. 15 years of early mornings, late nights, missed birthdays, and weekends spent solving problems no one else could solve. 15 years at Horizon Dynamics. And now it was over. No hearing. No second chance. No dignity. Just a carefully worded email informing him that the company had officially blamed him for a systems failure he never caused. The heater hummed weakly inside the truck. Outside, the empty highway stretched into darkness. James rested his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about Emma. His 10-year-old daughter was asleep at home, probably curled beneath her favorite patchwork blanket, believing her father could fix anything. Children have a way of seeing heroes where adults only see ordinary people. James wished he felt like a hero tonight. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The rain intensified. Headlights cut through sheets of silver water. The town disappeared behind him as he followed the winding mountain highway toward the small cabin he rented outside town. The radio played softly. Some old country song about loss and second chances. James barely heard it. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. How do you explain betrayal to a child who still believes the world is fair? A sudden flash appeared ahead. James narrowed his eyes. Something moved near the shoulder of the road. He slowed instinctively. Another flash. This time he realized it wasn't a reflection. It was a person, standing alone beside a disabled SUV. At midnight, in the middle of nowhere, James pulled over without hesitation. The SUV sat tilted slightly toward the ditch. Hazard lights blinked weakly through the storm. A woman stood near the driver's side door, one arm wrapped around herself against the cold. She looked exhausted. Not frightened. Not panicked. Just completely drained. James stepped out into the rain. "Ma'am," he called gently. "You okay?" The woman turned toward him. Even beneath the storm and darkness, he noticed something unusual in her expression. Not wealth. Not status. Just weariness. The kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. "My car died about 20 minutes ago," she said. Her voice was calm but strained. "Phone battery's gone too." James glanced toward the empty highway. No traffic. No gas stations. No help for miles. "Let me take a look," he said. She hesitated. Most people would. But something in James's steady voice seemed to reassure her. He examined the vehicle for several minutes while rain soaked through his jacket. Eventually he straightened. "Bad alternator," he said. "It's not going anywhere tonight." The woman nodded slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Wind swept across the highway. Water streamed down the side of the SUV. Then James looked at the dark road ahead and made a decision. The same kind of decision he had spent his entire life making. The kind that rarely benefited him but helped someone else. "I've got a cabin about 15 minutes from here," he said. "You can get warm, charge your phone, and figure things out in the morning." The woman stared at him. A complete stranger offering help when he clearly had troubles of his own. Her eyes softened slightly. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. James smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "Because everybody needs a second chance sometimes." Neither of them knew it yet. But by the time the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, that simple act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. The cabin sat beneath a grove of towering pine trees, its porch light glowing softly against the darkness like a beacon in the storm. James parked beside the woodpile and stepped out into the rain. The woman followed quietly, clutching the borrowed blanket he had found behind. The truck seat. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine needles through the night air. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. A stone fireplace occupied one corner. Family photographs lined the mantel. A faded drawing of a castle hung beside the refrigerator. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive, just the honest signs of a life built one sacrifice at a time. James switched on a lamp. Golden light filled the room. The woman looked around carefully. Her eyes lingered on the photographs. A young girl smiled from nearly every frame. School pictures, birthday pictures, fishing trips, Pumpkin patches. The kind of memories that mattered more than money. You have a daughter, she said quietly. James nodded. Emma. 10 years old. He glanced toward the hallway. She is asleep. The woman smiled faintly. It was the first genuine expression James had seen from her all evening. You must be proud of her. Every day, he replied. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The old clock above the fireplace ticked steadily. Peace settled over the room. James handed her a charging cable. Your phone should work again soon. Thank you. She sat at the kitchen table while the device slowly powered on. Almost immediately, the screen filled with missed calls and unread messages. Dozens of them. James noticed, but said nothing. Everyone carried burdens they did not discuss with strangers. The woman stared at the notifications. Something flickered across her face. Concern, frustration, maybe even guilt. Then she locked the screen and set the phone face down. James pretended not to notice. Instead, he filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. Coffee, he asked. Please. Minutes later, steam curled upward from 2 ceramic mugs. The warmth seemed to restore some color to her face. You look exhausted, James said gently. She laughed softly. Not the laugh of someone amused. The laugh of someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. That obvious? A little. Her fingers wrapped around the mug. Have you ever worked for something so long that you forgot why you started? James stared into his coffee. The question landed harder than she could have known. Yeah, he said. I think I know exactly what that feels like. The woman studied him. And what happens when the people you trust disappoint you? James smiled sadly. You keep your character anyway. She lowered her eyes. The answer seemed to affect her more than he expected. Just then, a bedroom door creaked open. Small footsteps padded down the hallway. James turned. Emma stood there wearing oversized pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess. She blinked at the stranger sitting in their kitchen. Dad, she whispered. Who is that? James walked over and knelt beside her. Someone who needed help tonight. Emma looked at the woman for several seconds. Then she smiled the way only children can. Completely free of suspicion. Completely free of judgment. Hi, she said. The woman smiled back. Something softened immediately in her expression. Hi. Emma disappeared briefly into her room and returned carrying a folded blanket. She carefully handed it to the stranger. You can use this one, she said. It is the warmest blanket in the house. The woman accepted it slowly. Her eyes glistened for a moment. Not because of the blanket itself, because kindness often means more when you least expect it. Outside, the storm continued across the mountains. Inside the cabin, however, something had begun to change. None of them knew that before another sunset arrived, truths buried for years would begin to surface, and the simple kindness shared around that kitchen table would become impossible to forget. The first light of dawn slipped through the pine trees and spilled across the cabin windows in pale bands of gold. James woke before his alarm, a habit formed by years of responsibility. For a moment he forgot everything. Then reality returned. The appeal, the job, the uncertainty waiting beyond the front door. He quietly stepped into the kitchen. The coffee maker sputtered to life. The familiar aroma filled the room. Outside, the storm had passed. The mountains stood silent beneath a clear Colorado sky. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, James carried the weight of unanswered questions. A few minutes later, he noticed. The blanket folded neatly on the couch. The woman was already awake. She stood on the porch, gazing toward the distant mountains as sunlight painted the horizon. She seemed different this morning. Stronger somehow. More composed. Yet there was still a sadness in her eyes that money could never fix. James stepped outside holding 2 mugs. Coffee, he asked. She accepted one with a grateful smile. Thank you. They stood quietly for a moment. The cold morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh rain. Birds chirped from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a truck rumbled along the highway. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. The kind that often become unforgettable later. I should probably go, she said finally. James nodded. Your phone working again? Yes. She glanced at the screen briefly before slipping it into her pocket. I have people looking for me. James laughed softly. Judging by the number of calls you got last night, I figured that out. For the first time, she laughed too. A genuine laugh. Warm and unexpected. You are very observant. Comes with being a father. The front door opened behind them. Emma appeared carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit. Her eyes immediately brightened when she saw the woman. "You are leaving?" Emma asked. The woman knelt beside her. "I am afraid so." Emma looked disappointed. "That is too bad. Dad does not smile much lately." James nearly choked on his coffee. "Emma." "What?" she asked innocently. "It is true." The woman smiled and looked at James. For a brief second, something passed between them. Understanding, respect, perhaps even recognition of wounds they both carried. The moment lingered before a line of black SUVs suddenly appeared on the distant road. James noticed them first. 3 vehicles moving quickly toward the property. The woman saw them and exhaled slowly. "Looks like they found me." Within minutes, the SUVs rolled to a stop near the driveway. Several professionally dressed individuals stepped out. Their expressions shifted instantly from concern to relief when they saw her. One man hurried forward. "Ma'am, we have been searching all night." James looked from the vehicles to the woman. Questions filled his mind, but he asked none of them. Character often reveals itself not through curiosity, but through restraint. The woman turned toward him. "Thank you for everything, James." Hearing his name from her lips felt strangely significant. "You never told me yours," he said. She hesitated. Then a small smile appeared. "Claire." Before he could ask another question, she reached into her purse and removed a simple white card. No title, no company logo, only a name and a phone number. She handed it to him. "If you ever need anything, call me." James glanced at the card. "I appreciate that." Claire looked once more at Emma, then back at James. There are not many people left who help others without expecting something in return. James shrugged. "My father taught me that character matters most when nobody is watching." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. The words seemed to strike something deep inside her. Then she stepped toward the waiting vehicles. James and Emma watched as the convoy disappeared down the mountain road. Within minutes, it was gone. The morning returned to silence. James slipped the card into his wallet and headed inside. He had no idea that before noon, he would walk into the most important meeting of his life and see Claire again under circumstances neither of them could have imagined. By 10:30 that morning, James Anderson was driving toward downtown Cedar Ridge with a knot in his stomach that refused to loosen. The call had come less than an hour earlier from Horizon Dynamics. One final review meeting. One final opportunity to address the allegations that had ended his career. James almost declined. Experience had taught him that corporations rarely admitted mistakes. Still, something inside him refused to walk away. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was the simple belief that truth deserved one more chance. The glass headquarters of Horizon Dynamics rose above the city like a monument to success. James remembered when the building first opened. He had helped design several of the production systems that made the company profitable. Back then, employees spoke about innovation and integrity. Lately, those words felt more like decorations than values. James parked his truck and stared at the entrance. Employees in tailored suits crossed the plaza carrying coffee and tablets. Some recognized him. Most quickly looked away. Nothing stings quite like being forgotten by people you once helped. Inside the lobby, the familiar scent of polished marble and fresh coffee greeted him. A receptionist escorted him to the executive conference floor. The elevator climbed steadily. Floor 12, floor 13, floor 14. Each passing number felt heavier than the last. The conference room overlooked the Rocky Mountains. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls. Around the long table sat senior managers, legal advisors, and department heads. James immediately spotted Victor Kane near the center of the room, the senior vice president who had led the investigation against him. Victor wore the confident smile of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. "Mr. Walker," Victor said pleasantly, "thank you for joining us." James nodded and took a seat. "I did not have much choice." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. The room settled into silence. Then the meeting began. Charts appeared on screens. Reports were distributed. Numbers filled the room. Yet despite all the presentations, James noticed something missing. Evidence. Real evidence. Every accusation seemed built upon assumptions and carefully selected conclusions. After nearly 30 minutes, Victor folded his hands confidently. Based on the findings, the company remains confident in its previous decision. James leaned back slowly. "Then why am I here?" No one answered immediately. Outside the windows, Clouds drifted across the mountains. Inside, tension quietly built. Finally, James spoke again. For 15 years, I helped solve problems nobody else wanted. I worked weekends, holidays, emergencies. If I made a mistake, show it to me. If I failed, prove it. But do not ask me to confess to something I did not do. The room grew still. Even Victor seemed slightly unsettled. James's voice remained calm. Calm voices often carry the greatest weight. Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors suddenly opened. Every head turned. A woman entered surrounded by several advisors. Her posture was confident, her expression composed. The executives around the table immediately stood. Chairs slid backward. Conversation stopped. Respect filled the room so quickly it felt rehearsed. James stared toward the doorway. His heartbeat slowed, then stopped. Claire walked into the room. The same woman from the mountain highway. The same woman who had shared coffee on his porch only hours earlier. She paused when she saw him. Surprise flickered briefly across her face before disappearing behind professional composure. James looked around the room. Every executive remained standing. Every executive except him. Confusion rippled through his thoughts. Then Victor spoke. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett." The name struck like thunder. Claire Bennett. James suddenly remembered hearing it years ago. Business magazines. Industry reports. Corporate acquisitions worth billions of dollars. Claire calmly took her seat at the head of the table. The seat reserved for the highest authority in the company. Only then did James begin to understand why 3 black SUVs had appeared outside his cabin at sunrise. And only then did he realize that the woman he had rescued during the storm was not merely a stranger. She was now the owner of Horizon Dynamics. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence carried more weight than any presentation that had come before it. Claire Bennett settled calmly into the chair at the head of the table and placed a slim folder in front of her. Sunlight reflected softly across the glass surface beside her. The executives remained standing until she nodded for them to sit. James watched the room carefully. Only minutes earlier, Victor Kane had controlled every conversation. Now even he seemed cautious. Claire opened the folder and glanced briefly around the table. "Before we continue," she said, "I would like to clarify something." Her voice was calm, professional, yet somehow impossible to ignore. "Last night, I spent several hours with a man who showed kindness when he had every reason to be bitter." James immediately lowered his eyes. He already knew who she meant. Claire continued. "He did not know my name. He did not know my position. He did not know I had completed the acquisition of this company less than 48 hours earlier." Several executives exchanged startled looks. Victor shifted slightly in his chair. Claire folded her hands. What impressed me most was not his generosity. It was his character. The room grew even quieter. James felt uncomfortable being discussed. Recognition had never interested him. Respect mattered. Truth mattered. Recognition was simply a byproduct. Claire turned a page inside the folder. "This morning I reviewed the investigation involving James Anderson." Victor immediately straightened. "Ms. Bennett, our legal team has already verified the findings." Claire raised a finger gently, not aggressively, simply enough to stop him. "It worked. I am aware of the findings," she said. "What concerns me is the process." She looked toward the legal advisors. "Can anyone explain why Mr. Walker was denied access to several audit reports used to support the accusations?" No one answered immediately. One attorney cleared his throat. Another adjusted his glasses. Victor finally spoke. "Certain materials were considered confidential." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "Confidential from whom?" Again, silence. The mountains beyond the windows seemed frozen in place. James watched carefully. For the first time in months, he sensed uncertainty among the people who had judged him so confidently. Claire opened another section of the folder. "Interesting." She paused. "I also noticed that several system failure reports originated from a department that reported directly to Mr. Kane." Victor's expression tightened slightly. "That is standard organizational structure." "Perhaps," Claire replied, "but it raises questions." She looked toward the chief technology officer seated near the far end of the table. "Have the original server logs been independently reviewed?" The executive hesitated. "Not independently." Claire closed the folder softly. The sound echoed through the conference room. "Then we are not discussing facts today." Her eyes moved slowly around the table. "We are discussing assumptions." Nobody challenged her. Nobody interrupted. Even the air seemed different now. James felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Hope. Not because he expected rescue. Not because he expected favors. Hope because someone was finally asking the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Claire turned toward James. Their eyes met briefly. "Mr. Walker," she said, "if the evidence is incomplete, then so is the judgment." James said nothing. He simply nodded. Sometimes dignity requires fewer words, not more. Claire then addressed the room. "Effective immediately, I am ordering a complete independent review of every report connected to this case." Victor's confident smile vanished completely, and for the first time since entering the building, James realized the story everyone believed might not survive the afternoon. The conference room emptied slowly over the next hour, but the tension remained. Executives gathered in small groups near the windows, speaking in lowered voices. Attorneys requested files. Auditors opened laptops. The comfortable certainty that had surrounded James's case for months was beginning to crack. Claire Bennett remained at the head of the table reviewing documents with remarkable focus. She was not rushing. She was not making dramatic speeches. She was simply following facts wherever they led. James sat quietly near the far end of the room. Years of experience had taught him that truth rarely arrives with noise. More often, it appears through small details everyone else overlooked. Shortly after noon, a team of independent auditors arrived from Denver. Boxes of archived records were delivered. Server backups were accessed. Internal communications were reviewed. One discovery led to another, then another. The atmosphere shifted with every passing minute. Around 2 o'clock, a senior auditor approached Claire carrying a thick folder. "You should see this," he said. Claire accepted the file and began turning pages. Her expression remained controlled, but James noticed her eyes narrowing slightly. Several executives leaned forward. Victor Kane sat unusually still. The auditor pointed toward a series of reports. These modification requests were submitted months before the system failure. Claire studied the documents. Who approved them? The auditor looked directly at Victor. Silence followed. Victor adjusted his tie. Those were routine operational decisions. Were they? Claire asked calmly. The auditor opened another report. The changes created vulnerabilities that later caused the failures blamed on Mr. Walker. A murmur spread through the room. James felt his chest tighten. For months he had tried explaining exactly that. Nobody had listened. Claire continued reading. The deeper the review went, the clearer the picture became. Critical warnings had been ignored. Internal recommendations had been altered. Several reports had been edited before reaching senior leadership. Piece by piece, the narrative constructed around James was falling apart. By late afternoon, sunlight stretched across the conference table in long golden bands. Dust floated through the light like tiny sparks. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. The truth had become impossible to ignore. Claire finally closed the folder and looked across the room. "Mr. Walker." James raised his eyes. "According to these findings, you repeatedly warned management about the exact issues that eventually occurred." "Yes," James replied quietly. Claire nodded. "And those warnings were documented." They were. Another auditor placed additional records on the table. Email chains, engineering reviews, risk assessments. Each document reinforced the same conclusion. James had not caused the problem. He had tried to prevent it. The realization settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Several executives looked visibly uncomfortable. Others appeared embarrassed. Character often reveals itself when people are forced to confront their own mistakes. Claire folded her hands. The company did not fail because someone told the truth. Her voice remained calm. The company failed because the truth was ignored. Nobody challenged her. Nobody could. Victor stared silently toward the windows. For the first time all day, he seemed unsure of what to say. James felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Relief. Not victory. Not revenge. Relief. The difference mattered. One seeks punishment. The other seeks justice. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountains, Claire requested one final report. The auditors exchanged glances before handing it over. After reading the first page, she became very still. Then she slowly lifted her eyes toward Victor Kane. And in that moment, everyone in the room realized the investigation was no longer about mistakes. It was about decisions. The room remained silent after Claire lowered the report onto the table. Outside, The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Inside, nobody seemed to notice the view anymore. Every eye was fixed on the documents lying in front of her. Claire glanced toward the auditors. "Please summarize your findings." The lead auditor adjusted his glasses and opened a binder thick with records. Over the past 18 months, multiple internal recommendations were blocked before reaching executive review. Several engineering concerns were reclassified. Budget requests connected to system stability were denied despite repeated warnings. He paused briefly. Most of those decisions originated from the same office. No one needed clarification. Victor Kane sat motionless. The confidence that had once filled his posture was gone. Claire folded her hands. Were these decisions disclosed to the board? No, the auditor replied. In several cases, the documentation appears to have been altered before distribution. A murmur moved around the table. One executive leaned back in disbelief. Another quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. James remained still. He felt no satisfaction watching people discover the truth. Only sadness. Horizon Dynamics had once been a company he loved. Seeing how far it had drifted was painful. Claire turned another page. "There is more." The auditor nodded. 6 years ago, Mr. Walker developed a recovery protocol that prevented a major operational shutdown. Internal estimates suggest it saved the company nearly $80 million. James frowned slightly. He remembered the project. Long nights. Endless troubleshooting. A small team working together because they believed it mattered. Why was that not included in his employment review? Claire asked. No one answered. The auditor continued. Because the credit was assigned elsewhere. This time the silence felt heavier. Claire slowly looked toward Victor. Assigned where? The auditor pointed to a document. To the Executive Oversight Division under Mr. Kane. Several heads turned immediately. Victor finally spoke. That was an administrative decision. Claire's expression did not change. Administrative decisions do not rewrite history. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. James lowered his gaze. Suddenly, dozens of confusing moments from the past began making sense. Promotions that never arrived. Projects that disappeared from reports. Recognition that always seemed to land somewhere else. He had never chased credit. He believed good work should speak for itself. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that belief. Claire closed the folder. Character matters, she said quietly. Not when life is easy. When power creates opportunities to take what does not belong to you. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended Victor. The facts were speaking clearly enough. As evening approached, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The investigation that destroyed James's career had not been designed to find truth. It had been designed to protect reputations. Claire stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. The fading sunlight reflected across the glass. Mr. Walker warned this company about problems. He solved problems. He protected this company. She turned back toward the room. Yet somehow he became the person blamed for decisions he did not make. The executives looked down at the table. One by one, they seemed unable to meet James's eyes. Then Claire returned to her seat and opened one final envelope recently delivered by the auditors. She read the first page carefully. A faint look of surprise crossed her face. Then she looked directly at James. "There is something else you deserve to know," she said. And the expression in her eyes suggested that the next revelation would change far more than his career. The conference room had grown completely. Still, outside, the last light of day stretched across the city skyline, turning the glass towers amber and gold. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered. Claire Bennett held the final document in her hands while James waited quietly across the table. He had already learned more in a few hours than he had in the previous year. Yet something in Claire's expression suggested the story was not finished. She looked down at the report once more before speaking. 3 months ago, before I began negotiations to acquire Horizon Dynamics, I hired an independent consulting firm to evaluate the company's leadership structure. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. Claire continued. Their findings identified one employee whose recommendations repeatedly improved performance, reduced risk, and increased long-term profitability. James frowned slightly. He had no idea where this was going. Claire slid a document across the table. That employee was you. James looked at the report. His name appeared throughout dozens of pages. Project reviews. Internal evaluations. Performance metrics. Independent analyses. The evidence painted a picture he had never seen before because nobody had ever shown it to him. Claire folded her hands. The consulting firm concluded that several of Horizon's most successful initiatives originated from your work. A senior board member leaned forward. How much value are we talking about? Claire glanced at the figures. Conservatively, more than $200 million over the past decade. The room fell silent again. James stared at the pages. Numbers had never motivated him. He cared about solving problems, helping people, building things that worked. Yet seeing years of effort finally acknowledged stirred something deep inside him. Not pride, validation. Across the room, Victor Kane suddenly spoke. Those estimates are speculative. Claire calmly looked at him. No, the financial outcomes are documented. Victor opened his mouth again, but stopped. The facts had become impossible to outrun. One of the board members slowly stood. If these findings are accurate, then we owe Mr. Walker an apology. Another executive nodded. Then another. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Respect was replacing assumption. Truth was replacing convenience. Claire turned toward James. There is one final matter. She opened another folder. The independent review also uncovered evidence that performance credits were systematically redirected away from key contributors. James already knew what that meant. So did everyone else. Claire placed the documents in front of the board. Based on these findings, I am recommending immediate leadership restructuring. No raised voices followed. No dramatic confrontation. Just quiet acceptance. Sometimes the strongest form of justice arrives without spectacle. One by one, board members reviewed the evidence and reached the same conclusion. Within minutes, formal motions were introduced. Decisions were recorded. Votes were cast. When the process ended, Victor Kane quietly gathered his belongings and left the room without a word. No one celebrated. No one mocked him. The silence carried its own lesson. Character mattered. Truth mattered. And eventually, both demanded a place at the table. As the conference room doors closed behind him, Claire looked toward James. The tension that had followed him for months seemed to lift from his shoulders. Yet what she said next surprised him more than anything else that day. Mr. Walker, she said softly, the board has agreed to restore far more than your reputation. James looked up. Claire smiled gently. Tomorrow morning, I would like to discuss your future with this company. The next morning arrived bright and clear, as if the storm from 2 nights earlier had never existed. James drove back to Horizon Dynamics with a different feeling in his chest. The uncertainty was gone. The anger was gone. What remained was something quieter. Peace. The mountains stood tall against a cloudless Colorado sky as he entered the building. Employees who once avoided eye contact now greeted him with respectful nods. Some offered apologies. Others simply smiled. James accepted each gesture with grace. Resentment had never been his way. On the top floor, Claire Bennett waited in the same conference room where everything had changed. Sunlight poured through the glass walls. A single folder rested on the table. Good morning, James, she said. Good morning, Claire. She smiled at the sound of her first name. Somehow it felt less like a board meeting and more like two people continuing a conversation that had begun on a rainy highway. Claire opened the folder and slid it toward him. The board unanimously approved this offer. James looked down. Executive Vice President of Operations. The position sat several levels above the role he once held. For a moment, he simply stared at the page. That is a generous offer, he said. Claire shook her head gently. No, it is an overdue one. James leaned back in his chair. You know, a year ago I probably would have accepted immediately. Claire studied him. And now? James smiled softly. Now I have a daughter who measures success differently. Claire laughed quietly. How does she measure it? Whether I am home in time for dinner. The room filled with comfortable silence. Then Claire surprised him. Would you like to know why I really came to Cedar Ridge? James nodded. Claire looked out toward the mountains. I was exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. Every boardroom sounded the same. Every conversation felt transactional. I was beginning to wonder whether integrity still existed in business. She turned back toward him. Then I met a man who had just lost everything and still chose kindness. James lowered his eyes. I was just helping someone. Exactly, Claire said. That is what made it matter. Later that evening, a black SUV followed the winding road to James's cabin. Not a convoy this time. Just one vehicle. Claire stepped out carrying a pie from a local bakery she had stopped at along the way. The porch light glowed warmly against the evening sky. Before she could knock, the front door opened. Emma stood there grinning. "I knew it was you." Claire laughed. "How?" Dad smiled when he looked out the window. James appeared behind his daughter, shaking his head. "I cannot argue with that logic." Emma looked between them and then asked the question that stopped everyone for a moment. "Are you staying for dinner?" The evening breeze moved gently through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang softly. Claire looked at James. James looked at Claire. Neither spoke immediately. Then Claire smiled. "If that invitation is still available, I would love to." Emma cheered and disappeared into the house. James stepped aside and held the door open. As Claire walked inside, she realized something important. The greatest reward was never the company. It was not the title. It was not the victory. It was finding people whose character remained steady when life gave them every reason to become bitter. And as laughter drifted from the small cabin beneath the Colorado stars, the silence that followed was not empty. It was the quiet sound of redemption, second chances, and a future neither of them had expected to find.